the title of this one is An Indictment of Life, an introduction to antinatalism for the dissident right. Now, I've said before, my background there, dissident right would sort of refer to, well, it's a big umbrella, anything that sort of is opposed to sort of what we would call, wokeness, sort of extreme liberal progressivism, that kind of thing. So, that background I came from, it was sort of an ethno-nationalist background, and any group could be ethno-nationalist. I saw your interview with, was it Israeli TV or radio? You did with
Right,
the
Israeli TV, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Israel is actually probably the example that comes to mind of a modern sort of ethno-nationalist state. And I always think, if you're going to try and convince anyone, particularly a group, of the merit of antinatalism, it's best if you sort of come from their background, so you're sort of like an insider rather than an outsider. And if you're an insider, then they're more likely to listen to you because you're sort of one of their own, if you know what I mean. So me coming from that background, and I wanted to achieve sort of a synthesis between the two, because I could see a lot of truth on their side for certain things, but obviously I couldn't endorse the sort of pro-natalism, which is obviously going to be inherent to any sort of genetic conservationist kind of movement, which is what it is. It has its political elements obviously as well, but it's kind of like applied to certain types of humans, the same thing as the conservation of animals, like for instance the tiger and that kind of thing. And of course I have argued with that for the animal itself, it's not necessarily a bad thing that it goes extinct, because the animal doesn't think like we do. It doesn't have foreknowledge in that way. It doesn't really care, and in a way it's kind of a self-centered concern that we want them to not go extinct, because I think the real motivating factor there is that we have an attachment to these animals. They're part of human culture, nursery rhymes, everyone knows what a tiger and a lion is and that kind of thing. So, and that's what I tried to do with this. I tried to reframe it as, well, of course, a lot of the, I think, white nationalist types see it as, like I say, genetic conservation. But I decided to sort of, my tactic was to sort of flip that on its head and say, if we love our people so much, how can we, and care about them, how can we justify bringing them into this world, which obviously doesn't care about any of us, and it's full of such risk and all the rest of it. And that's when I would then introduce all of the antinatal shtick, if you will.
Okay, great.
Yeah. One of the questions I remember originally when I first started, when I first tried to bridge the gap between these two sort of worldviews, which I had a lot of respect for both. And I think more than anything, I just have this fanatical dedication to the truth for its own sake, which I think comes from autism. I think that is something which is particular to autism. And I always think whatever the truth is, even if it's something I personally might not like, I would put up my hands and say it is what it is, and I wouldn't contest it. It happens sometimes when I go on like this, I lose my place. Where was I going with this?
Well, I think maybe this time to start reading.
Oh yeah. I was just going to say one thing, obviously, because obviously David Benatar is sort of it's become the nucleus, the focus point for antinatalism in the digital age. And some of my old comrades, shall we call them, and I knew this was going to happen, they straight away asked about his background, and they said, is his name Aramaic? And I said, well, I have no idea about that. As far as he's from South Africa. I believe he's Jewish, and his father was involved in bioethics, I think it was, or he was on I don't know, he was involved in some institution or some board that was about bioethics, So I straight away wanted to tell them, he doesn't have any kind of radical background or other agenda being smuggled in here. He's not like a communist, or he's not extremely woke or anything. And in fact, actually, spoke out, I believe, against affirmative action, and he wrote that book you might know of. It's obviously not the main focus of what he does. Most people probably don't know it, even if they know him. What was it called now? I've got it written here. The Second Sexism, Discrimination Against Men and Boys, which obviously sounds like quite an anti-woke book because it's going against the prevailing sort of feminist narrative, I suppose. He's talking about men as the victims of discrimination. So I tried to establish his credentials there and say, just because a lot of academics of a Jewish background tend to be quite sort of radical on the left side of things, David is not like that at all, and I trust him 100%. I've only ever spoken to him one time, very briefly by email. I don't know if that really counts as talking to him because it's via text, obviously, and that was when I sent him, well, what would now be a very outdated version of my essay, because it's grown larger since then. This was in 2020, I believe it was, and he said he appreciated it. I'm not sure if he read the entire thing, but he did say that he was extraordinarily busy, so he couldn't devote a lot of his time to answering me specifically. But I got the impression I was lucky to even get an acknowledgement, really, because the man is extraordinarily busy, and I know he's very exacting when he replies to his critics. I've gone through some of them, and some of them are too long, even for me, and I just sort of stand back and think, well, it's really long, so I'm just going to take his word for it. He knows what he's talking about, and I trust him. I mean, it's as with anyone, I very much doubt me and him would agree about absolutely everything for every aspect of life, and he's not like a god to me. I don't worship him or anything. I just happen to agree with what he says about procreative ethics, and I think he's one of the brightest minds we have going at the moment. And it's a hard choice, but if someone said pick one philosopher, at least living philosopher, that you think is the most important, in a non-political sort of way, I suppose I would say David. I think he's the most important one. Hopefully he'll, although his birth was a harm to him, it's going to be very valuable for the rest of us, and I hope he's around for years and years to come.
Thank you. Okay, let's go.
Okay, I'll begin now. An Indictment of Life, an Introduction to Antinatalism to the Dissident Right, by myself. Quote, "For there is surely no greater horror than that which should not be, but is." End quote. These words resonated with me the moment I first heard them. What greater description of life, vilest of all sexually transmitted diseases, an unnecessary and unprofitable intermission, dividing an eternity of silence, could be summoned forth from the poet's quill. I always had the suspicion that something was very wrong with the world. I could sense it, like a sound so faint that you aren't even sure it's really there. As I got older, it grew bolder, more distinct, until eventually it became deafening, and I could hear nothing else. I wasn't sure if it was just my life that was the problem, or existence itself. Some years ago, after I read Better Never to Have Been and The Human Predicament by David Benatar, Keeping Ourselves in the Dark by Colin Feltham, and Every Cradle is a Grave by Sarah Perry, everything seemed to come into ghastly focus. I had seen a terrible truth, and I could never unsee it. I made an ethical decision in that moment that I would never have children. There are few ideas more controversial than antinatalism. Not even the Nazis elicit such a hostile reaction from people of every persuasion. It is a challenge to our greatest conceit that life is a good thing. It is the final frontier for humanity, and I am profoundly drawn to it. But I know others find it unconscionable. I am no stranger to controversy, but no position I have ever taken has ever provoked such visceral rage and disgust as antinatalism. It is an intolerable view for many, not least of all because it rejects the celebration of life that has inspired our most noble endeavours. It goes against the grain, against billions of years of evolutionary drive. Having children is arguably the most life-affirming act of all, and is such an integral part of the human experience that, in the eyes of many, to question the assumed beneficence of procreation is to become a social pariah. Various personalities within the dissident right have made the occasional reference to antinatalism, notably Professor Edward Dutton, who uses it when talking about the manifestations of high mutational load among so-called spiteful mutants. Quote, I have a high mutational load, that's evidenced by the amount of things I have wrong with me, and I am persuaded by antinatalism, although I'm not a liberal progressive. Dutton uses antinatalism, the phrase, interchangeably with child-free, a term that refers to a lifestyle choice with hedonistic connotations, which we have tried to distance from ethical antinatalism. He is apparently unaware that while antinatalist sentiments have always been expressed by a minuscule minority of people throughout recorded history, in more recent years it has become a fully fledged philosophy. An exceptionally robust framework for it has been crafted by one man, Professor David Benatar, at the University of Cape Town. He is an elusive individual who has only given a handful of interviews, although the number is steadily growing. Most of these to internet personalities who have requested to have him as a guest on their podcasts. His reasons for guarding his private life and not allowing any images of himself to be seen are apparently due to fears that his life could be threatened, as his books represent what is likely the most controversial worldview ever conceived. His books are Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, followed by The Human Predicament. In terms of personal information, not much is known about the man. Although he is not a liberal progressive, having opposed affirmative action, written a book about misandry, the second sexism, discrimination against men and boys, and having made no overt mention of race or politics in any of his work, some people in the dissident right who encounter him are dismissive or suspicious because of his name. I understand why they might be suspicious, having been a great admirer of Kevin MacDonald's Culture of Critique series, which examines the historical and contemporary conflict between Jews and Gentiles through an evolutionary lens, and makes the case for Judaism as a group evolutionary strategy. While it is unlikely that Benatar and I would agree on every issue, I always defend his reputation. He is not a political radical. I see nothing partisan or subversive in any of his work, and the only time he makes any reference to his heritage is in the introduction to his first book, where he quotes an old Jewish proverb about the misfortune of being born. Benatar is not the only person who has come to deeply pessimistic conclusions about the quality of human life and the ultimate futility of existence. And I mention again the books I mentioned at the start by the other authors, which are other such tombs. As with any philosophy, antinatalism begins with the acceptance of certain axioms. In the face of uncertainty and a high likelihood of inflicting incalculable harm, it is essential to invoke the precautionary principle when the question of procreation is raised. The precautionary principle states that if an action may cause grave harm, there is a case for counteracting measures to ensure that the action does not take place. It encompasses the following points. 1. The principle of reverse onus states that it is the responsibility of those supporting an action to demonstrate that it is not seriously harmful, thereby removing the burden of proof from those potentially harmed by the action: people, animals, ecosystems, etc. In the case of procreation, natalists have failed to establish that reproduction is not significantly harmful. Second point, the principle of alternative assessment stipulates that no potentially harmful action may be undertaken if there are alternative actions available that safely achieve the same goals as the action proposed. In the case of procreation, safe alternatives such as adopting a child or adopting an animal are available. 3. All societal deliberations bearing on the application of these points must be open, informed, and democratic, and must include all affected parties. It is clear that the vast majority of procreative deliberations are closed, uninformed or misinformed, and undemocratic. They do not include the majority of affected parties, most obviously the unborn, but also the innumerable people and animals whom the unborn person will affect during their lifetime. Benatar's thesis rests upon several asymmetries between the good things and the bad things in life. That was the completion of all those 3 points, by the way. One is an empirical asymmetry between pleasure and pain, that the worst suffering is more intense than the best pleasure. Some have objected to this because he doesn't explain exactly how the measurements are being done. What metrics does Benatar use? He begins with the conclusion that severe pain is more intense than immense pleasure, and that pain is overwhelmingly more prevalent in life. But even if this is true, it does not follow that a being would prefer non-existence. He responds to such queries by asking these people to consider whether they would endure an hour of the worst torture imaginable in exchange for an hour, or even a whole day, of the most sublime pleasures imaginable. People reject the proposition, an indication that suffering is indeed more intense than happiness, even of shorter duration. One might feel tempted to interject that pain only seems more intense than pleasure because avoidance of injury is a higher priority for an organism than acquiring benefit. I doubt this. Why would the qualia of pain, at least physical pain, be contingent upon one's priorities? I see no connection there. Furthermore, if we specify in Benatar's wager that you will survive the torture, that you will only experience the pain, but will not be permanently disfigured, people still decline the offer. Our worst emotional pains also outweigh our most intense emotional highs. One need only contrast the joy of parenthood with the indescribable grief of losing a child, which can be enough to make one regret ever having children. Others have raised the objection that antinatalism is divorced from the Darwinian origins of morality. They have claimed that it is built on an inverted morality, that it takes the evolutionary mechanisms we use to survive, compassion, empathy, and aversion to suffering, and uses them as the basis to advocate for our self-imposed extinction, which is what these mechanisms evolved to prevent in the first place. I would answer this by saying that the focus of antinatalism is on the qualia of pain, which is inherently negative, rather than the instrumental value it has in some circumstances. The function of pain is communicative, alerting you that something is wrong and encouraging you to remove yourself from whatever is causing the pain stimuli, thereby preserving your life and potential lineage. I recoil when I put my hand on a hot surface, but does that mean I am life affirming? No. It is an involuntary reaction, one which I have little choice in. Pain will always be bad, with or without instrumental value, since even when it has instrumental value, the intensity of it is often horrendously disproportionate. Its fundamental essence is negative, regardless of the questionable testimony of masochists to the contrary. Suffering is also rendered gratuitous when nothing can be done about the pain, as is often the case for wild animals, and has been the case among humans for the majority of our time on this planet. Another asymmetry is an axiological one, which is multifaceted. Positive self-testimony about the quality of one's life is tainted by an optimism bias, which is evolutionarily hardwired. Many of our positive evaluations are myopic and unreliable because of this phenomenon, which Benatar describes in considerable detail. A rose-tinted worldview is evolutionarily selected for, but it remains a deception. I value the truth for its own sake. I wouldn't want to be under an illusion, even if it gave me a sense of meaning and purpose, as the illusion of God does for billions of people all over the world. I value authenticity and honesty, even if it shines the light on an unbearable truth. In addition, an individual's testimony that they enjoy their life is irrelevant to the creation of new lives, because people who already exist usually have an interest in continuing that existence, whereas a potential person has not yet acquired any such interest, and therefore the good things in life do not have the same value for the pre-existing person as they do. No, sorry, I got that wrong. Do not have the same value for the pre-existing as they do for the existing. For this reason, positive assessments cannot serve as a justification for creating new lives. It really isn't that difficult to understand, but so many people fail to appreciate the dividing line between before existence and after coming into it. The value of any life-affirming experience undergoes a major shift between scenarios. It has value for someone in the existence scenario, but it counts for nothing in the pre-existence scenario. Many people, even when they claim to have finally understood, will often relapse and have to be reminded. It is very challenging for them to grasp this, and they often fail to maintain a firm grip, so repetition is needed. Because the optimism bias is so deeply embedded in our primitive hindbrain, the reflexive response when many people encounter antinatalism for the first time is the spiteful non sequitur, "Why don't you just kill yourself?" This indignation is a programmed response, an indication that the hindbrain is entering defense mode, an automatic reaction whenever our most cherished illusions are threatened. It is not uncommon for them to unleash a tirade of flippant and insensitive remarks that are not rationally informed. This was discussed at length during a podcast with Sam Harris in 2018, which I think is Benatar's best recorded debate. Sam is soft-spoken and brings a tepid liberal perspective to many issues, but I applaud his valiant attempt to challenge postmodern relativism in his book, The Moral Landscape. I believe Sam is correct, and that his book represents a truly noble effort, in spite of whatever flaws it may have. Despite the sharp distinction Benatar draws between coming into existence and continuing to exist, Sam reflected on whether the antinatalist philosophy implies that we should all end our lives, and he coined the term pro-mortalism to describe this dilemma. Benatar rejected this with astute reasoning, as always, but I still feel that Sam made an invaluable contribution to what is already a spectacularly provocative subject. Regarding the distinction, Benatar uses the following analogy to help people understand the major difference between coming into existence, continuing that existence, and ceasing to exist. Suppose you buy a ticket to a movie. You spend a good deal of money and have an emotional investment in the experience. But after a while, it becomes increasingly apparent that the film is a huge disappointment. It might not be so terrible that you choose to leave, given that you have invested a lot in this, which is the problem of sunk costs. But if you had known beforehand that it was going to fall short of your expectations, you never would have bought a ticket in the first place. One slight problem with this analogy is that the moviegoer already exists and therefore has an interest in seeing what they believe will be a good film, unlike a potential person who has no interest in coming into existence. But it remains a helpful analogy, since a lot of people confuse the question of a life worth continuing, of which there are many, with that of a life worth starting, of which there are none. It is a very important distinction to understand. The central premise is that there is no net benefit to being born, as encapsulated in Benatar's maxim, there is no need to create need. Since the world as it exists is not optimally calibrated for our well-being, creating a new life can only ever entail degradation. To have an adequate appreciation of this, it is essential to also understand the problem of non-God objects, which is the most ironclad argument that atheists have against the existence of a benevolent deity. Both arguments draw upon the same perfectionist expectations, and I personally think that perfectionism, or an inclination to perfectionist thinking, is a prerequisite for being drawn to antinatalism. Benatar makes use of a concept in negative utilitarianism known as the pinprick argument, which states that, due to the axiological asymmetry between pleasure and pain, an idyllic and eternal life of endless pleasure marred by the negativity of only a single pinprick is a comparatively worse option than the neutrality of never coming into existence. In order for coming into existence to be ethically permissible, life would have to be perfect in every conceivable way, and even this could only ever achieve neutrality in comparison to never coming into existence. There is no conceivable way for coming into existence to be a better option than never coming into existence, since pleasure in a world that contains pain merely serves an ameliorative function, while a world consisting of only pleasurable experiences would be something that one could not have been deprived of if one had never come into existence. The mitigatory function of the good things in life adds a further dimension to the axiological asymmetry. Pleasure is invariably a palliative in that it relieves a discomfort or deprivation rather than being a good in itself. Since the positive experiences in life only have value in alleviating the default negativity, a satisfied desire is equivalent to the desire having never existed in the first place, as illustrated by the anti-frustrationist moral theory developed by Christoph Frege and adopted by Peter Singer. Many pleasures also come at great cost, either to oneself or to others. Schopenhauer famously juxtaposed the satiety of a feasting lion with the suffering of its prey being eaten alive. Pleasure is fleeting and requires sacrifice, while suffering is prolonged and intense. Similarly, creation is hard, while destruction is easy. Knowledge requires learning and dedication, but ignorance is effortless. In light of this, it cannot plausibly be denied that evil has a serious and inherent advantage in our world. We cannot transcend the dualism of negativity and positivity, as they are fundamentally irreconcilable. Our agonizing predicament as sentient creatures is born of these two incongruent forces existing simultaneously. While there is something why there is something rather than nothing is the greatest question. That the something happens to be so disproportionately awful is the greatest tragedy. In a rare moment of levity, Benatar humorously describes his position on abortion as pro-death, stating his conviction that the moral imperative should in fact be to prevent new lives rather than create them. This would preferably be done at the earliest stages of gestation, when the developing cells cannot yet be considered a person in the morally relevant sense. This also helps make the procedure. Oh, sorry, I lost my place. This also helps make the procedure less emotionally traumatic for the prospective parents and the physician. Many people have questioned Benatar as to who benefits from not being brought into existence, a barrier in their thought process, which he refers to as the non-identity problem. I admit that my cognition had initially come up against this barrier as well, as I thought that Benatar had committed a fatal flaw here. I'll now go through how I resolved this. He says that failing to create new people is not bad because non-existent people will never be deprived of the meager amount of good in the world. But if we accept that, then it also means that non-existent people are not spared the overwhelming negativity of life. We have not saved anyone, as there is nobody to be a beneficiary of our ethical choice not to procreate. For instance, if I decide not to stab somebody, then that person has unknowingly benefited from my choice to refrain from action. I can point them out specifically as the person who has benefited from my ethical decision, because they already exist. But if I choose not to procreate, who has benefited from my inaction? Nobody has. The problem, as I initially saw it, was that while non-existent pleasure for non-existent people was not bad, following the same logic, non-existent suffering for non-existent people was not good. Benatar was arguing correctly that life is bad, but the notion that a dichotomy exists, that life is bad and therefore the vacuum of space is somehow an abstract good by comparison, is one I found hard to sustain. How could the neutrality of the vacuum of space, devoid of any sentient experience, be equated to an abstract good, even in comparison to the overwhelming negativity of life? Neutrality, by its very definition, is the absence of good or bad qualities. Life is a net negative, but at least it is a tangible something, whereas non-existence is an intangible nothing. Something and nothing are the greatest contrasts we can imagine, but one has admittedly mostly negative qualities, while the other is incapable of being evaluated. In this sense, the two are incomparable. Life may be bad, but what's the alternative? The coin appeared to have only one side. Life seemed to be the only game in town. In response to the many others who had made the same criticism, Benatar claimed to be talking about states of affairs rather than actual persons, but that seemed like a semantic diversion. It was still a blatant double standard to apply an experiential mode of argumentation for one scenario, people who aren't born aren't deprived of pleasure, and an abstract, non-experiential mode for the other scenario. The absence of suffering is good even if there's nobody to appreciate it. But this in turn would imply that we are not justified in our practice of terminating deformed fetuses or providing euthanasia for people who wish to end their lives, since the deformed fetus and the suffering person won't benefit either. The only people who appear to benefit from this suffering being avoided are ourselves, as we do not have to witness it and feel guilty for allowing it. As such, the motivations for aborting or euthanizing cannot be considered philanthropic, but rather self-centered. We benefit by preventing the start and continuation of suffering, but that's it. To bring the deformed child into the world would be evil, but to abort it would not be anything to the child. To allow the suffering person to go on living would be cruel, but to end their life would not be anything to the person. Should we negate those options on such grounds, we would then be left in the uncomfortable position of allowing the deformed fetus to be born, of allowing the suffering person to go on living against their will, which would of course be experientially bad for them. I was determined to circumvent this apparent stalemate, but it would require repetitive rumination. Benatar had drawn on an abstract argument and an experiential argument simultaneously in his axiological asymmetry. He had taken an abstract stance on the vacuum of space being neutral, and from this neutral he had implicitly extrapolated a good, which seemed impossible. But then he was taking an experiential stance, nobody is deprived, on the absence of pleasure in non-existence. I initially thought that a rule of logic had been violated here. To make use of both abstract and experiential arguments and not apply them consistently is intellectually dishonest. If you are going to take an abstract stance on one scenario, or non-scenario, as that is what non-existence would be, then you are obliged to take an abstract stance on the other. Likewise, if you are going to take an experiential stance, you must stick to that stance for both the scenario, existence, and the non-scenario. Otherwise, it is cherry-picking, applying certain rules when it suits your argument and disregarding them when it is inconvenient. Benatar says the absence of suffering can be good even when there's nobody there to appreciate it, as in the case of a deformed fetus being aborted, where it becomes a default good in comparison to the alternative. My initial retort had been that if one is going to say that something is good in an abstract, that is, non-experiential sense, then in order to be consistent, one would have to concede that a lack of happiness in the universe would also constitute an abstract negative. While reconsidering his empirical asymmetry, the solution came to me. Pain and suffering are more intense and enduring than pleasure and happiness, and the antinatalist could therefore concede that while the total absence of pleasure in the universe may constitute an abstract bad, one should place higher status on the abstract good of a universe completely devoid of suffering, since suffering is the more intense of the two states. This conclusion is also strengthened by pleasure being a palliative against the default tedium, as opposed to default contentment, of existence. If pleasure only has value for those who already exist, it cannot be used as a justification for creating new lives. I'm glad I was finally able to resolve this issue in Benatar's favor. I still felt there was a debate to be had in the abstract context regarding aggregate suffering weighed against aggregate pleasure, but I soon realized that an answer to this had already been provided in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula Guin. In the book, there exists a utopian city called Omelas, where everybody lives in a state of perpetual bliss. However, the paradise of the city is contingent upon the continuous torture and suffering of a single child. Denizens of the city learn of this after reaching an appropriate age, and some feel that they can no longer, in good conscience, continue to enjoy the city's bounties while knowing the cost, and so they walk away to an imperfect life outside the city's walls. This serves to illustrate that even maximum happiness for all people would be outweighed by the maximum suffering of a single individual, irrespective of whether we are talking about an actual or a prospective state of affairs. Although justifiable in light of such cost, to abandon the trajectory of our species and close the door on all future possibilities would still seem like a monumental and tragic loss in the eyes of most existing people. Although we cannot live forever, we have an interest in continuing the human species in order to vicariously satisfy our curiosity regarding potential future developments. Closing the door on this is only tragic for those of us who are already here and have acquired a taste for life, however. It is not a loss for the unborn, who do not share our dopamine addiction. We should also consider that, to the extent that it can be considered a loss, it pales in comparison to the many imagined scenarios that are already unrealized. The premise of Gwyn's book reflects the terrible price that is paid in order to continue the human experiment. There was a time, until relatively recently in the grand scheme of things, when people could find themselves buried alive. Medical historians prefer to downplay the extent of this, but there are reliable accounts which prove beyond any doubt that this nightmarish fate did indeed occur more often than is comfortable to admit, and would even befall children. One case I recall concerned a teenage girl in the 1880s who was buried and then exhumed a few days later. A burial shroud was torn to shreds. There was significant damage to the interior of the casket. Her fingernails had ripped away, chunks of her hair had been torn out, and her face was contorted in an expression of unimaginable terror. Although rare, there are also accounts concerning pregnant women being exhumed, wherein they were discovered to have apparently given birth in the confines of the coffin after waking from suspended animation. Now, one might say that our medical knowledge has improved to the extent that such horrific occurrences are practically inconceivable today, but all who affirm life and partake in its veneration are implicitly endorsing the suffering of prior generations, the unspoken assumption being that what they went through was somehow worth it in order to have reached the point we are at now. As such, the security and improved living conditions of future generations will always be contingent upon the suffering of intermediate generations, and this is never an acceptable price to pay, as there is no need to create those future generations. The life of that young girl in the 1880s and my life today are among countless stepping stones that have been laid down to reach a mirage of paradise that lies forever on the horizon. Future generations are perched atop a pyramid of prior generations who suffered indescribably, and the suffering of one generation is not an acceptable price to ensure the existence of the next generation, because the next generation does not yet exist and has no interest in coming into existence. It is, as Benatar has said, a procreational Ponzi scheme. For this reason, sacrifices made for the attainment of a better future, let alone a perfect one, can never be justified. In any case, the world that we live in is both imperfect and imperfectible, since for a world to be truly perfect, it would have to be flawless from its inception. Perfection is immutable and eternal, not a product of refinement. Any intermediary process of improvement would be incompatible with the definition of perfection. A masochistic mentality, which I have come to call the struggle is the glory, is pervasive among natalists, who like to argue that suffering is not inherently bad and can create positive value in one's life. Benatar uses extreme examples of people living in chronic pain, which some believe is intellectually dishonest. His opponents claim that most of the suffering which people experience is transitory, that the subsequent decisions that come from suffering are entirely subjective to the person who endures it, and that adversity can help us grow. This is not only pitiful and desperate, but downright indecent. in a pathetic attempt to minimize, or perhaps even trivialize, the tragedy of suffering. His opponents are effectively condoning and perpetuating it by ascribing it meaning. A good example of this is a story I recall about a woman who had her legs amputated after she nearly died in a bus rollover. Just changing the page. She went on to become a successful Paralympian and won a gold medal, which she saw as the silver lining in her tragedy. And for this reason, she had no regrets about what happened to her. Are we seriously to believe that she values her gold medal more than her legs? Would she still have boarded that bus if she could have seen her future? Would she have regarded the gold medal as a worthy trade for her legs before her irreversible accident? Of course not. And this reveals stoicism for the coping mechanism it is. People only ever embrace suffering when there's nothing they can do about it. Their ego will not allow them to admit that they suffered a catastrophic loss for no gain. To determine the valence of any given thing, one need only ask, would I freely choose this if I were under no duress? Nobody in their right mind would choose to be born deformed. Nobody would choose to have the stretch marks of pregnancy. Nobody would choose to brush their teeth or go to the toilet. Nobody would choose to do anything they didn't want to do if they didn't have to. This generates a formidable proposition. How much of life as it is would we choose if given complete freedom? The only limitation being our imagination. Almost none of it. 99% of daily activity is extraneous minutiae, bearing no relation to our deepest desires. We live for an infinitesimal amount of time, and only a microscopic portion of that time is spent doing the things we enjoy. In a universe where time is an inexhaustible commodity, the sheer scale of such wasted potential is painful to contemplate. But even if I had an infinite supply of time, I still wouldn't choose to waste one precious moment doing anything that didn't bring me joy. I'm just going to pause for a minute to have a drink of water. Here we go. No matter what excuses one makes, it would still be preferable if adversity were not necessary for character development and personal growth, or whatever contrived nonsense the people espousing the look on the bright side mantra are driving at. It is very similar to the appalling life is a test argument espoused by theists. I would be furious if my parents confessed that they created me under the cheerful assumption that I would adapt, just like everyone else, to life's hardships. We only adjust to unfavorable circumstances because we have no choice. Anyone who brings a person into the world so they can suffer loss and then grow stronger by adapting is a bastard of gargantuan proportions. You don't deliberately create a problem just so you can tack on a half-baked solution, nor do you create a being out of nothing so that it can struggle to fulfill cravings that did not exist prior to its creation. The desire for meaning is perhaps the most insatiable craving that we have, but only existing people suffer this torment. We are forever lamenting that life isn't fair, yet we seldom consider this a reason not to perpetuate the human condition. We would never accept that the pleasure of a few justifies the misery of the many, but nor should we accept that the suffering of a few is an acceptable trade for the comfort of the many. Life is a zero-sum game. In order to have our slice of cake, someone else had to draw the short straw. Someone had to plummet to their death on 9/11. Someone had to get cancer. Someone had to be raped to death. Billions of potential people living in ecstasy would not justify a single person suffering such a fate. Quote, antinatalism is like the inadvertent outing of humanity's closet, and all visceral opposition to it, nothing more than the exposed psyche's dread at having its secrets revealed, says Chip Smith, philosophical pessimist and founder of Nine Banded Books. I've observed countless times how people who regard the topic as merely silly become increasingly vituperative as the discussion progresses. When they become aware that the antinatalist position exists, their brains react instinctively. They undergo a fundamental shift in their cognition, from brain structures that facilitate logic to the older structures that are emotionally charged. At that point, they are absorbing everything the antinatalist says through the lens of their offense, and nothing generates more obloquy than pessimism. End quote. Pessimism is by far the most reviled philosophy, and society detests pessimists more than anything because they are a threat to morale. Anyone who identifies consciousness as the source of all horror will be encouraged to throw themselves off a cliff with alacrity by all those still running enthusiastically on the evolutionary treadmill. I once considered myself a white nationalist, but having seen the sick game of life on Earth for what it is, a grotesque carnival of suffering and death, I have embraced antinatalism and, for the most part, left politics behind. All of our problems are deep and intractable features of life itself, and in any case, a problem solved is a problem caused, as solutions invariably lead to new dilemmas. What is better than a problem overcome? The problem never having existed in the first place, of course, and the same thing can be said for the satisfaction of all our needs, wants, desires, and preferences. It would be better if everything were perfect from the beginning, so nobody would have to suffer the intermediary stages on the arduous path to a hypothetical and ultimately illusory better world that never arrives. On the rare occasions when there is improvement, it is incremental and insufficient, arriving too late and at such a cost in human suffering as to disgrace the entire enterprise. I no longer have an ego investment in the continuation of our race or species. I no longer believe the fight is worth winning. People will say I'm giving up, but that implies there's something to give up on. There isn't. From an individual perspective, the world ends for us when we die. It continues to exist once we are gone, as it did before we were born. But it's not our problem anymore. Nihilism is a word often used in the dissident right to describe just about anything that conflicts with their ethnopolitical goals. And much like the now overused degeneracy condemnation, it becomes meaningless when used so liberally. Ironically enough, meaninglessness is what nihilism is concerned with. From a cosmic perspective, mankind is indeed ephemeral and insignificant, but I don't feel this is something we can nonchalantly brush aside. For those of us who are constantly mired in deep thought, it is a source of tremendous angst. Our situation is an appalling one, that we have come to exist in a universe which does not acknowledge, validate, or reciprocate us in any way. In this sense, we are all orphans. Our most heartfelt questions and pleas are directed in vain to the entropic churn of a vast abyss. As a species, we are alone, but we are also alone as individuals. We are all confined within a brain and body we did not choose and which will inevitably fail us, sometimes in the most horrific ways imaginable. A blind and unconditional reverence for one's culture and ancestors, many of whom lived horrendous lives while obliviously creating more people to share in their misery, is an aspect of ethno-nationalism which is hard to ignore. I would therefore classify the movement as a fertility cult. Those content to remain on the evolutionary treadmill will either turn a blind eye to nature's cruelty or will try to excuse the inexcusable by appealing to the eternal wisdom of nature's laws. Despite the initial appearance of concern for our people, the white nationalist suddenly develops a stoic appreciation for life's hardships upon encountering antinatalism, embracing with enthusiasm the very suffering he was lamenting only moments ago. He then proceeds to wave it all away as acceptable collateral damage in the great quest to fulfill Faustian man's destiny, securing dominion over the earth and seeding space with his Hyperborean progeny. Such intergalactic Lebensraum fantasies are driven by an egocentric desire to achieve vicarious immortality, a delusion of grandeur if ever there was one. I no longer partake in the sycophantic veneration of our ancestors and the sacralization of life implicit in such a practice. It is curious and more than a little convenient that the ancestors people invoke always happen to be the supposedly good ones. We seldom consider that we are all descended from a murderer or a rapist at some point in our lineage. For those of us who suffer indescribably, our ancestors are worthy of the deepest contempt. The imperative to pass on one's cultural heritage is just one of many egotistical baubles that serve as bait to keep us running on the evolutionary treadmill, and can never be sufficient justification for gambling with another's fate. The margin for error is simply too great. It doesn't matter how good a hand someone may think they have been dealt in life, since it will all be taken away from them with the passage of time. Death of our loved ones and of ourselves is a huge problem, but this does not imply that life is good. Society is founded on an implicit natalism, but this unspoken consensus has no serious thought behind it. We are expected to be eternally grateful for a gift we never invited. I have no reason to worship my ancestors. On the contrary, I have every reason to curse them. It could be said that procreators worship nature by offering her a child sacrifice. I defy her by denying her this. I am not imposing a harm, nor am I withholding a benefit. I still support the dissident right on many issues and acknowledge the legitimacy of their grievances, but I can no longer condone procreation. My conscience will no longer allow it, because my compassion for our people comes before my desire to see us win nature's absurd gladiatorial tournament. This ferocious desire to win for the sake of winning, for vengeance and justice at any price, no matter how many lives it costs, is what really motivates the dissident right. I came to the conclusion after many discussions that white nationalism is not as concerned with the welfare of our people as it claims. I have asked, how can we ethically justify bringing a white child into a world where they are guaranteed to suffer and die? An answer is never provided, and on a few occasions the supposedly pro-white individual became markedly agitated and, in an astonishing reversal of principle, dismissed the suffering of prior and even current generations of Europeans. The welfare of our people ceases to be important for the white nationalist once he realizes that it can be used to argue that creating white children is to condemn them to the significant possibility of immeasurable suffering and the absolute certainty of death. We are all ultimately just organic machines, replicating for the sake of replicating, with no genuine autonomy or purpose. We are all crucibles of suffering. Wallowing in our misery is not a choice, but rather the default state, as many illnesses, particularly of the mind, are incurable and inescapable. The nearest one can get to shutting down one's brain, short of dying, is to sleep. I could never bring myself to condemn a child to such an awful fate. We are not petrified of the nothingness before we are born, precisely because there is no us to be aware of it. Our suffering arises in being woken from it and knowing we must inevitably return to it. Nothingness is a paradox, a word to describe a something which is in fact not a thing at all. Our minds are constrained by inherent linguistic and conceptual limitations. We cannot conceive of nothingness any more than a blind man can imagine colours he has never seen. We are all ultimately destined to go back to the void of nothingness, and our awareness of this is a torment that remains ever present in our subconscious. It would therefore have been better to never have been woken from the nothingness, as we would not then be condemned to the absurdity of living in fear of it. Contrary to what many believe, the finality of death does indeed nullify any purpose we might otherwise convince ourselves that our lives have. Once we accept the accuracy of depressive realism and the validity of pessimism, it can only lead to the conclusion that we have a moral imperative to not create more human beings to suffer the pain and existential angst of consciousness. Once we realize that this whole endeavor is ultimately pointless, which is arguably the end game of all knowledge, the sensible decision is to stop feeding the meat grinder. Do not disturb the unborn from their eternal sleep in the blessed calm of non-existence. Only then will this ridiculous Sisyphean nightmare be brought to an end. I'm just going to stop to have another drink of water for a minute. There we go. I will admit that there remain, at least to my mind, a few minor inconsistencies with Benatar's philosophy. For instance, I noticed he has a habit of saying, "You can't have a child for that child's sake." But it seems equally true that you cannot not have a child for that child's sake. Non-existent people cannot consent to being born, that is true, but they also cannot withhold consent. I guess he could say that people don't technically withhold consent to being robbed and murdered either, so maybe it's silly for me to bring that up. I should point out, though, that while nobody laments all the non-existent people who could be experiencing pleasure, it is also the case that nobody rejoices at all the non-existent people who are not experiencing suffering. When Benatar says that abortion should be carried out at the earliest stages of gestation, when the fetus, quote, cannot be considered a person in the morally relevant sense, one could ask how he can advocate for its merciful termination if it can't yet be considered a person. Benatar would presumably reply that it would likely become a person. But isn't that exactly what anti-abortionists say? That even if it's just a clump of cells now, it would in all likelihood go on to become a person, and therefore it is a retroactive form of murder? Benatar's argument that it constitutes a preemptive form of mercy hinges on looking ahead to a future state, just as much as the pro-life position does. He also says that life is an imposition, but an imposition on whom? A potential person is entirely hypothetical. So his saying that life is imposed on the unborn implies that a person and their life are two separate things, which we know they are not, unless he believes in souls, but I know that he is not a fool. Anyone myopic enough to believe in souls wouldn't be drawn to this debate in the first place. Perhaps my asking whom life is being imposed upon is an indication that I lack the cognitive dexterity to fully grasp the non-identity problem, though I think I've done much better than most. I think the most salient question to determine whether something is desirable or has value is, as I said, to ask, would I freely choose this under no duress? Applying this question to my own life, the answer is an emphatic no. But applied to human life more generally, my answer is a more subdued but still resolute no. I have said before that the problem for the individual and for humanity at large is that everything about the world and how it works seems to be in conflict with our will. Life is more friction than function, and the few positive experiences that keep us from killing ourselves are unintentional byproducts. In a universe so macabre and merciless, it is surely a miracle that they exist at all. It is only too easy for us to envisage an idyllic scenario in which we exist in a somewhat recognizable form, while not being the crude organic machines we are in our present reality. So much of our misery is exacerbated by our ability to imagine a world infinitely better than the one in which we are doomed to remain. We can see it in our mind's eye, but we can never get there, and it torments us to the end of our days. I don't think the vast majority of antinatalists truly want nothingness. I think they want that perfect world, the one we should have had. Evolution is a blind, merciless system which thrives on competition and discrimination. There is no equality, fairness, or justice in nature, because they are completely antithetical to the ruthless process of elimination that produced all living things. There is no honor or dignity in being a part of this, and certainly no freedom. We will all face a personal annihilation, religious consolations notwithstanding, and the species itself will not last forever. Antinatalism advocates not starting lives, and while the end of humanity would be an inevitable consequence of this, it would occur in due course anyway, likely under the most atrocious circumstances. Our oceans will evaporate about 1 billion years from now. Then our sun will become a red giant and engulf all the planets in our solar system. Sometime after that, the Milky Way will collide with the Andromeda Galaxy, and then finally will come the heat death of the universe. Better a comparatively peaceful exit under somewhat controlled conditions than the vast array of catastrophes that random chance could bestow upon us. Taking the long view is the most assured way to deflate one's racial ego, as it is often forgotten that the destruction of all things is inevitable. Life is merely the procrastination of death. Here are 2 quotes from Richard Dawkins, which serve to illustrate the cognitive dissonance among natalists. Quote, "We are going to die, and that makes us the lucky ones. Most people are never going to die because they are never going to be born. The potential people who could have been here in my place, but who will never see the light of day, outnumber the sand grains of the Sahara. Among those unborn ghosts will be greater poets than Keats, scientists greater than Newton. We know this because the amount of potential people who could be created from the human genome so massively exceeds the number of existing people. In the teeth of such stupefying odds, it is you and I in our ordinariness who are here. How dare we, the privileged few who won the lottery of birth against all odds, complain about our inevitable return to the void from which an infinite majority have never stirred." End quote. The second quote now. Quote, "The total amount of suffering each day in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive. Many others are running for their lives, whimpering in fear. Others are slowly being devoured from within by rasping parasites, and thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. If there is ever a time of plenty, it will inevitably lead to an increase in the population until resources are depleted and the natural state of starvation and misery is restored. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and DNA replication, many are going to be harmed, some are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is indeed no design, no purpose, no good and evil, nothing but pitiless indifference." End quote. From a human perspective, which is really the only one that matters since there is no other, I would certainly describe this as an evil system. Many people may feel comfortable tossing an innocent person into this meat grinder, but I don't. Dawkins, giddy as a schoolboy over the wonder of it all, while simultaneously acknowledging the horror of it all, demonstrates an obliviousness common to all, from the lowliest peasant to the most enlightened men of science. The lion's gustatory satisfaction does not justify or outweigh the terror of its prey being hunted and eaten alive. If naturalists want to blame Benatar for increasing the amount of misery in the world with his views, they can place just as much blame on nature documentaries. Horrors are occurring all around us, hidden in plain sight. People all too often choose not to notice, but it still happens, no matter how much we ignore it. Antinatalists are not guilty of imposing this on any new people. We only draw attention to the suffering that existing beings are enduring and creating. If the worst aspects of reality are such an affront to people's sensibilities that they can't even bear to acknowledge them, then they should definitely think more seriously before they spread the joy by reproducing. I think this pervasive optimism stems from an inclination to religious thinking. While I do see the infinite potential for good that could have been realized by a deity if they existed, they have evidently chosen not to exploit this potential to its fullest. Hence my dissatisfaction and disinclination to believe in any such deity. Dawkins understands this, but he cannot, or perhaps will not, follow it through to the antenatal conclusion. In this respect, he is just as much a true believer as any creationist. Evolution is synonymous with life itself, and the essence of evolution is eternal struggle. Life is something to be endured, not enjoyed. This clashes with what we want life to be about. We long for a recreational existence, one predicated on happiness for its own sake. In the world as it is, though, enjoyment is merely an unintentional byproduct of an uncaring gene replication machine. Imperfection is thus a feature of the system, not a bug. It is encoded into the algorithm of the universe. For those of us who are already here, there is no hope. The best we can do is choose not to continue the chain of suffering. Don't create new sentient beings that will suffer the torment and agony of consciousness only to die. There is no need to create need out of nothing. Just stop feeding into the system. All it will cost is a slice of your ego. Years ago, when I was watching some old footage of slums in Victorian London, I saw an image that really stuck with me. Through all the filth and depravity, misery and decay, a heavily pregnant stray dog was limping along. It was the perfect illustration of the incorrigible, indomitable will of life to replicate itself, despite a complete lack of good reason to do so. In that moment, I realized that we antinatalists have the most Herculean task before us. We have to rouse the apathetic, amorphous masses of humanity, festering in their own squalor and ignorance, to address a question they never even knew existed. The analogy of the fish oblivious to the water in which it has been immersed its entire life is a very fitting one. There is a great deal of exasperation in store for us, far more, I dare say, than is in store for the dissident right in its battle against wokeness. All the procreational platitudes we encounter with nauseating repetition are mere hope and cope, no better than the secular creationism of the woke mob. Professor Dutton and the procreators of the dissident right will have to take on board that it is rationally indefensible to bring children into this world. and will therefore have to formally admit that their choice is gratuitous and self-serving, and that their progeny will have every right to hold them accountable on such grounds, should anything go wrong. And if we include death in the aforementioned anything, then every single parent will owe an unpayable debt to their child. Some will continue to profess agnosticism as to whether we should or should not procreate. But if we apply the agnostic stance in other scenarios, such as taking a neutral stance on rape because a woman might be a masochist who enjoys it, then we can see how inappropriate it is. In reply to the claim that a potential person could cure cancer and therefore we should create them, I would say, as Benatar does, that we do not have the right to rope more people into the quicksand with us. Anyone who thinks otherwise is viewing new lives as a means to an end. We existing people suffer from innumerable evils, but it is not permissible to create new people in order to potentially alleviate our current suffering. The only way to stop the chain of suffering once and for all is to desist from procreation. Most people would hesitate to call this a victory, though, because it entails the negation of all possible future scenarios. Because there is no tangible reward in this victory, they will struggle to see it as such. We can pretend that by focusing on what little we do have, that we can somehow shield ourselves from the wickedness of the world. But such willful misdirection does not prevent us from falling victim to misfortunes far beyond our ability to prevent. Our locus of control is very much external, and blind happenstance dictates the course of our lives more than we would like to admit. Every day we ignore the overwhelming evidence that there is something fundamentally wrong with our existence. What could be so intolerable about it? Benatar answers unequivocally, everything. Although it would be the solution to all human problems, antinatalism does not necessarily present itself as something to be enforced upon the entire world. It can be a purely personal choice. I do not murder people, for instance, but murder still occurs in the world. Would the case therefore be made that, because of this, I might as well join in also? Obviously not. I also wish to clarify that I am only opposed to the suffering of the innocent. I suspend my objection to suffering in cases where an individual is needlessly unpleasant enough to prove themselves deserving of it. In conclusion, I shall now share some of the most pertinent passages from Benatar's books, which I have consolidated as best I can into a coherent whole. I shall now begin with these quotes, which are taken from different parts of his books that I've tried to assemble into a chronological order. Quote, "While nobody is lucky enough to be born, everybody is unlucky enough to have been born, and particularly bad luck it is too. On the quite plausible assumption that one's genetic origin is a necessary but not sufficient condition for having come into existence, one could not have been formed by anything other than the particular gametes which produced the zygote from which one developed. This in turn implies that one could not have had any genetic parents other than those that one does have. It follows from this that any person's chances of having come into existence are extremely remote. The existence of any one person is dependent not only on that person's parents themselves having come into existence and having met, but also on their having conceived that person at the exact time that they did. Mere moments might make a difference as to which particular sperm is instrumental in a conception. The recognition of how unlikely it was that one would have come into existence, combined with the recognition that coming into existence is always a serious harm, yields the conclusion that one's having come into existence is astronomically bad luck. It is unfortunate enough when one suffers some harm, but it is all the more traumatic when the chances of sustaining that harm were very remote. Creating new people by having children is such a fundamental part of life that it is rarely thought to require a justification. Most people do not even think about whether they should or should not make a baby. They just make one. For most of human history, up until very recently, procreation had been an inevitable consequence of sex, rather than the calculated decision to bring new people into existence. Those who do make a premeditated decision to have a child may do so for any number of reasons, but among those reasons cannot be the interests of the potential child. One can never have a child for that child's sake. While there are many good people who go to great lengths to protect their children from harm, few of them realize that the one and only guaranteed way to prevent all the suffering of their children is not to bring them into existence in the first place. We infrequently contemplate the pain, frustration, disappointment, anxiety, grief, and death that await any newborn child. We cannot predict what form these harms will take or how severe they will be, but we can be certain that at least some of them are guaranteed to occur. On the other hand, none of this befalls the non-existent. Only those who exist suffer harm. All things considered, a charmed life is incredibly rare. For every one such life, there are millions of wretched lives. Some people, such as those in impoverished countries, know that their child will be among the unfortunate, yet proceed to create them anyway. Nobody knows, however, that their child will be one of the comparatively lucky few. Great suffering could await any person that is brought into existence, and even the most privileged among us could beget a child who might suffer unbearably in any number of ways. They could develop a degenerative disease, be afflicted with mental illness, be maimed, raped, tortured, or murdered brutally. The optimist surely bears the burden of justifying this procreational Ponzi scheme, given that existence confers no net advantage over never being born. It is therefore hard to see how the significant risk of serious harm can ever be justified. Procreators are ultimately playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun, one they aim not at themselves, but at their future offspring. Furthermore, if we count not only the severe harms, but also the more routine inconveniences and struggles of daily life, which are seldom considered, we find that the deck is stacked against us to a staggering degree. I'm just going to pause a minute to have a drink again. There we go. Even the extent to which our desires and goals are fulfilled. Oh, damn page has jumped a minute. I have to turn it back now. Sorry, there we go. Even the extent to which our desires and goals are fulfilled creates a misleadingly optimistic impression of the quality of our lived experience. This is because we unknowingly practice a form of self-censorship in the formulation of our desires and goals. While some of them are never fulfilled due to circumstantial factors, there are many more potential desires that we do not even formulate, because we know that they lie outside the realm of possibility. We know, for instance, that we cannot live for a few hundred years, and that we cannot attain a genius level of expertise in all the subjects we are interested in. We therefore set goals that are more realistic, and in so doing, we hope to live a life that is, by human standards, a long and fulfilling one. And we hope to gain expertise in some narrowly focused area. Even if our realistic desires are fulfilled, our lives still fall abysmally short of how well they would be going if the formulation of our desires had not been artificially restricted. Further insight into the poor quality of human life can be gained by considering various features that are thought to be components of a good life and noting what limited quantities of these characterize even the best lives. Knowledge and understanding are widely thought to be good, and we are often awestruck by how much knowledge and understanding some people have. However, on the spectrum from total ignorance to omniscience, even the cleverest, most educated people are much closer to the unfortunate end of that spectrum. Compared to what we do know and understand, there are innumerable things we do not know and understand. If knowledge is such a good thing and we have so little of it, we are not faring very well at all. Similarly, we consider longevity to be a good thing, assuming said life is above a minimum quality threshold. And yet, even the longest human lives are ultimately fleeting. If longevity is such a good thing, then a life in full vigor lasting 1,000 years would be much better than a life of 80 or 90 years, especially when those final years entail the indignity of physical and mental deterioration. The longest human lives are much closer to 1 year than to 1,000 years, and even more distant from several thousand. Compared against such imaginative standards, we do not fare well at all. Most of us are oblivious to the heavy preponderance of negativity in our lives because we have accommodated to the human condition. Our expectations and evaluations are rooted in this baseline, and we therefore fail to notice just how bad things are. Longevity, for example, is judged relative to the longest actual human lifespans and not relative to an ideal standard. The same is true of knowledge, understanding, moral goodness, and aesthetic appreciation. Similarly, we routinely expect recovery to take longer than injury, and thus we judge the quality of life on that baseline, even though it is an appalling fact of life that the odds are stacked against us as much as they are. Because the negative features I describe are common to all lives, though some lives are considerably more miserable than others, they play very little role in how people assess the quality of their lives. It is true for everybody that the worst pains are more intense than the best pleasures, and that pains often last much longer. We all have to work hard to ward off unpleasantness and seek out positive experiences. Thus, when people judge the quality of their own lives by comparing them to the lives of others, they will neglect to include these universal features in the equation. It is often suggested that the bad things in life are necessary in order to appreciate the good things, or at least to offer some form of contrast in order to appreciate them fully. According to this view, we can only enjoy pleasures as much as we do because we also experience pain. It is said that our achievements are more satisfying if we have to work hard to attain them, and fulfilled desires mean more to us because we know that desires are not always fulfilled. There are many problems with this argument. First of all, these claims are not always true. There is much pain that serves no purpose at all, such as labor pains or the pain caused by terminal diseases. While the pain associated with kidney stones would now lead somebody to seek medical help, such pain served no purpose for the most of human history, since there was no treatment available. There are also a few pleasures we can enjoy without having to experience pain. Pleasant tastes, for instance, do not require any experience of pain or unpleasantness. Similarly, many achievements can be satisfying even if they involve less striving, or even none at all. In fact, there may indeed be a particular satisfaction in the ease of attainment. There might be some individual variation. Maybe some people are more capable of enjoying pleasure without having to experience pain, and more capable of taking satisfaction in achievements that come with ease. Second, insofar as the good things in life do require a contrast in order to be fully appreciated, It is not clear that this appreciation requires quite so much bad as there is. We do not require millions of people suffering from chronic pain, infectious diseases, and tumors in order to appreciate the good things in life. We could enjoy our achievements without having to work quite so hard to attain them. To the extent that the bad things in life really are necessary, our lives are much worse than they would be if the bad things were not necessary. There are both real and conceivable beings in which nociceptive, which means specialized neural pathways, detect and transmit noxious stimuli, resulting in avoidance without being mediated by pain. It is true of plants and simple animal organisms, and it is also true of the reflex arc in more complex animals such as humans. We can also imagine beings much more rational than ourselves, in which aversive behavior is mediated by a rational faculty rather than a capacity to feel pain. In such beings, a noxious stimulus would be received but not felt, at least not in the way pain is, and the rational faculty would, as reliably as pain, induce the being to withdraw. It would be much better to be that sort of being than to be our sort of being. Similarly, it would be better to be the sort of being who could appreciate the good things in life without having to experience bad things, and without having to work exceptionally hard to attain the good things. Life in which there is no gain without pain are much worse than lives in which there could be the same gain without pain. The optimist's impatience with and condemnation of pessimism invariably has a smug macho tone, although this is certainly not a response exclusive to males. There is an instantaneous contempt for the perceived weakness of the pessimist, a contempt that increases in intensity the longer the optimist is exposed to a discussion of unpalatable realities. This grin and bear it attitude is defective, for the same reason that Stoicism in general is defective. It is an inappropriate denial of suffering, or worse still, a complete indifference to it. The injunction to look on the bright side should be greeted with both skepticism and cynicism. To insist that the bright side is always the right side is to put ideology before evidence. While every cloud may have a silver lining, it may very well be the cloud rather than the lining on which one should focus, if one is to avoid being drenched by self-deception. Cheerful optimists have a much less realistic view of themselves and the world than those who are depressed. Upon even casual reflection, there seems something rather absurd about the earnestness of our pursuits. We are born, we live, we suffer along the way, and then we die, obliterated for eternity. It's hardly surprising that so many people ask what this is all about. Our lives are entirely ephemeral on the cosmic scale, but we need not step back quite that far to see that there seems something futile about our endless strivings, which are not altogether different from a hamster on its wheel. Much of our lives are filled with recurring mundane activities that we wouldn't choose to waste our time with if they weren't a necessity. The purpose of these chores is to keep the whole cycle going, whether it be working, shopping, cooking, feeding, defecating, abluting, laundering, dishwashing, bill paying, or tedious engagements with innumerable bureaucracies. Even if these tasks are thought to serve other goals, the attainment of those goals only yields further goals to be pursued. This cycle continues until one dies, but the treadmill is intergenerational because people continue to have children, thereby creating new mill treaders. This has continued for generations and will continue indefinitely until humanity meets its inevitable end in extinction, which is the way of all species, and it is hubris to think we will be an exception. It seems like the ultimate exercise in futility, a long and repetitive journey to nowhere. If we take a sober look at the human condition, unclouded by sentimentality, we see an unpleasant picture. However, there are powerful biological drives against fully recognizing how awful our situation is, which explains why so many people are able to put it out of their minds for much of the time. This is a mixed blessing, since those who do not sufficiently feel the weight of the human predicament serve as vectors for its transmission to new generations. It is unlikely that many people will accept the conclusion that coming into existence is always a harm, and it is even less likely that many people will stop having children. It is far more likely that my views will be either ignored or dismissed, since this response will account for a great deal of suffering between now and the demise of humanity. Those who issue it cannot be considered philanthropic. I am by no means implying that everyone who dismisses my arguments is a bad person at heart, but their dismissal does betray a callous indifference to the harm of coming into existence. Life's big questions are big in the sense that they are momentous. However, contrary to appearances, they are not big in the sense of being unanswerable. It is only that the answers are generally unpalatable. There is no great mystery, but there is plenty of horror. Life is bad, but so too is death. Of course, life is not bad in every way, and neither is death bad in every way. However, both life and death are, in crucial respects, awful. Together they form an existential vice, the wretched grip that enforces our predicament, from which there is no escape. Few prospective parents consider this, nor do they consider the impact their potential lineage will have upon the world. How many more producers of excrement and urine, flatulence, sweat, vomit, and blood do we really need? How much more human waste do we need to process? How many more corpses do we need to dispose of? It would be an aesthetic improvement at the least if there were fewer people. End quote. And that is the end of the essay.
Wow, that was astonishing. Yeah, I think we should stop there. And I know that you had some things that you've added on to the essay fairly recently, and maybe we can do another recording for that. But that was a momentous essay.
Yeah, I was still I still beat myself up a little bit and think it's not quite good enough.
Well, I think every author thinks that. Can I just ask you one little tiny point, which I just took a note of, which is you said something. You quoted some guy. I think his name was Chip. I'm not sure, and he'd written 9 banned books. Is that correct?
Well, nine banded books is the emporium that he founded, I believe.
Oh, 9 banded books.
Yeah, after an armadillo. It's a weird title.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you can find that online?
9 banded books. I think that it has its own website, and Chip Smith is the founder. I had talked to him by email over the years now and again. I think at one point I annoyed him a little bit. I can't remember, but we soon resolved that. Yeah, so he's a little cranky, but I know him because he's done an interview once or twice with Countercurrents, which is a dissident right website, which has a lot of articles and such like. He did an interview with them once, so that's how I came to know him.
Great. Okay, that's all really I wanted to ask. Thank you so much for that, and beautifully read as well. And I'll
try my best, because I sometimes think I might need elocution lessons or something.
Not at all. It was really, really well delivered. Okay, have a great day, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you very much.